Why are all these nerds talking about connections? Here to answer that question is Nice, free learner, self-educator, professional connection maker, and Finnish man. Nice, welcome to the
Thanks,
show.
man. Connections fucking rule. What can you say? It's the best.
Connections are the best. They're the absolute best. Oh, by the way, just before this, follow us on Twitter. James is at Expira Learning. Expira spelled like experiment without the ment part. Nace,
Exactly.
Your Story of the Sea. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
And I'm ZDRKS.
All of
Yeah,
these links
we're
will be
gonna-
in the description.
Exactly. We're gonna take over Twitter this year.
Yes.
This month.
It's going to be excellent. We're going to be dropping golden nuggets, connections, all sorts.
everywhere.
It's going to be great. Oh,
All right.
Man. Anyway, so the reason why we're talking about connections is because we saw this. Well, actually, should we talk about before that? Because we've been talking about connections for like months.
Exactly. Dude, we've got to do a timeline of the connection items because multiple people in the Discord seem to come to this, come to the conclusion of using sort of analogy-based items or connection items at the same time, but they all seem
Right.
to come to the same conclusion sort of independently of each other.
Right. And the
everyone seems to have their
instantiations
own-
of it are slightly different.
Exactly.
So
So, who's going to give the timeline? I'm not as familiar with it as perhaps you two because I haven't been using SM like that much recently. So this all just sort of happened around me, and I just sort of saw all of you guys talking about connection items. I was sort of clueless, but obviously now I've heard the arguments. I've heard all of the the various clashes between the different factions of connection item makers. So who wants to give a sort of rundown of how this all came about?
yeah, I'll say my side of it, I guess. I don't really know what it is because I haven't really talked about it until now, but it's funny because I think we're all operating under a different definition of what a connection is. You know, like what is a connection item? Everybody thinks of something different. Some people have it as like, you know, think of this or what is this like or something like this. And me, like I have more specific connections between things like, you know, what is the overlap between this or how are these two things related or this kind of thing. So
Yeah,
to
I
me, a
think
connection
that's
item-
the. Sorry
Go
to
ahead.
interrupt you. Just you
No,
said the word relate, and I think that's the key word. Finding relations, finding
Right.
things that group together, and it's not exactly like they don't necessarily must have similar features, but for some reason they have some sort of relation between each other, and I think
That's
that's
right.
the
interesting.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that's the
that's-
key feature as well.
Okay, yeah, that's super interesting because to me, like hearing about connection items, about analogy items, that sort of thing, I think the first thing that came to my mind was just recognizing some similarity between two systems and then making an item based on that. But
Right.
it seems like what you're saying, Nice, is that the your definition of a connection item is broader than that. It can subsume sort of any relationship between two systems. So it could be similarity, it could be dissimilarity, or any other possible relation between those two things.
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah,
yes.
I definitely feel that same way, and I'll just, if I talk about how this was born in my own mind, I think it goes back to this notion. I remember talking years ago with Arya on the Discord about how it feels different, even if you have a good set of items, or theoretically good, what I thought was good at the time, it feels different over time than the initial learning about something. If you fully understand something and you have it all, you know, loaded up in your working memory or short-term memory, it feels different just experientially than if you theoretically remember all of the same facts, you know, with a set of items. And we were talking about how that's kind of inevitable, and it kind of sucks that you can't feel the same way. And I'm not referring to fluency. I don't even mean that. I just mean just a kind of familiarity with the material and this way that all these things are activated in the mind at the same time. And I think part of what happens when you're learning something is that the brain finds connections naturally, right? So when you're first learning something, your brain goes, oh, that's like this, or this is like that. And up until, you know, some months ago, if you don't encode those in a set of items, then there's at least one component of the initial learning experience that would be missing from your items, which is that what is this like
Mm.
type of thing. So of course you're going to be missing that crucial piece.
Mm.
And I guess part of it is that me trying to match. I want to have the same level of familiarity or comfortability with the material over time as I had right in the beginning. And I think a key part of that is this natural feature of the brain to associate. And you might say, well, when you think of a regular item in the first place, wouldn't your brain then associate? And it's like, yeah, maybe so. But what about if you encode the associations themselves so you sort of skip that point and ensure that your brain activates? And also, it carries with it a bunch of other benefits like we've been discussing about, aiding understanding, and also aids memory and it aids applicability, these kinds of things.
Could you give like just a very simple example of what you consider to be prototypical example of a connection item?
Yeah, I actually I have one that I've told to people many times, and it's related to the stuff we talk about, so I'll just repeat it again. So here's one. What is the overlap between Woz's advice for dealing with complex concepts and Daniel Kahneman's goal for thinking fast and slow? And the answer to that is reduce the complexity of something by giving it a name, right? And so that's not an obvious thing. Like you have to read both of those things at roughly the same time and think of them, and then I just realized that connection, so I made an item out of it, right? And the point is, you're always making these connections. You're always going, oh my gosh, this is like that, or that's like this, But if you just don't write those down, it doesn't. It just leaves like everything else. And see, this is again, it relates to this larger bias, I guess, that people have, where they recognize that they forget the ideas of others, but they don't recognize that they forget their own ideas. And so when you have a connection, it's not a given that you'll always remember that or that you'll think of it at the right time. That's not how the brain works. If you don't write something down or think of it with some regularity, refresh it, it won't be remembered. So I think part of the reason why this is kind of hard to discover or not many people talk about it is because, again, of that stupidity. And again, we all share this of thinking that because it was your idea, you'll remember it.
Okay. So it seems like you've been interested in this idea for a while. You mentioned when Arya was in the Discord as well, so that must have been like a couple of years. Nice.
Right.
How long have you been thinking about connection items, and what's your sense of them?
Well, for me, it's pretty new actually. It's I don't know. It's like 2 months. 2 months I came to this big enlightenment, and there's like definitely history behind that because I've been reading tons of Woz's writing, but it seems to me that he uses some different terminology to describe some kind of similar things, but like jigsaw puzzle and what else? Like he talks about generalization and conceptualization and all these kind of things, abstract knowledge, and I read them. I read them all, but I never really absorbed it. How do you say? I never really understood clearly how it manifests itself in practical learning, actual learning.
Right.
I understood the principles, but I never kind of felt it, right? So 2 months ago, I think I was writing a blog about something. I was writing about some applicability, some typical stuff, and then I recall this quote from Elon Musk. He says, "If you cannot connect it, you are not going to remember it." So there's something like that. The phrasing isn't probably the exact, but he says this, and just suddenly all the pieces what was written about jigsaw puzzles and all this I don't know, it's like this huge crystallization of this big idea that we are building these clusters of nodes in our brain, these semantic clusters, and I don't know, just everything came together at once, and I possibly cannot explain it at this sitting, but anyways, from there on, I really started experimenting with these kind of connection items, making analogies and these kind of things, and they just work miraculously for me. And yeah, just started like a couple of months ago.
Yeah, I think it's so. It really is like a natural feature of the brain, and that point from Elon Musk about how you won't remember it. Not only that, but I think they can also function as a test of understanding. So if you can't make a connection, that means that you don't really understand it, because everything that you understand, technically, I think, and maybe someone has an issue with this, maybe this is not true, but it seems like everything that you actually understand, you can make a connection or an analogy with how it's like something else.
Yeah, I think that
Right,
it
right.
works as this very great screening tool also, that if you
Right,
cannot make any
right,
connections, it's 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 a big signal that it's asemantic material you are dealing with.
right. Which is like, I think those tests of understanding are really useful, because there's an intuitive sense that we'll know whether we understand something or not. But often the time at which you recognize that you don't understand something is when you need to utilize it to form something new, a new idea, a new connection, whatever it is. So you have to push against it, and these connection items can act as that thing pushing against it. So I think that's really useful, in the same way that like writing items is useful in a generic sense, because if you can't write a good item, you probably don't understand it well, that kind of thing.
Mm.
Okay, okay. So I'm really interested in knowing what sort of things you're making analogies from and to, if you know what I mean. Like,
Mm.
uh, what's the source and what's the target of the analogy in a sense. So, like, I guess you can start just by, I don't know, talking about like what areas have you found connection items useful for, and like how were you making the connections? Were they like between something very intuitive in your daily life, like cooking or something like that, and
Mm.
the thing that you're learning, like an academic subject like math, or is it something different? Like, what's the
Mm.
process like for you?
Yeah, I would be curious how Nace thinks about that, because I think his connection items are definitely looser than mine, and that's meant probably in a good sense. Maybe in another sense
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
bad,
yeah.
because the items could be the items could be less stable over time, but still I think it's positive. So I'd be curious how you think of that.
Yeah, I really think that, as the video showed, which we probably should link in description,
Mm.
the video about what was the analogy is
Analogy is
the
the core of cognition.
yes, and it really feels to me that it absolutely is the core of everything. It's the grandmother of everything, and I
Right.
think all these learning styles, like you know, Feynman techniques, and explaining to somebody, like to learn something, you should explain it to others and things like this. And I think it stems all from making analogies and kind of make these connections between synaptic pattern nodes, whatever you call it.
Mm.
And yeah, for me it's definitely broader, I think, than strat or math. And this because well, I'm still experimenting, and I started noticing myself to narrow these items down sometimes. If there's like a lot of like very many connections, very many ideas overlapping, so I need to kind of narrow the target down with some keywords or cues or whatever. But anyways,
Mm.
your question was about what kind of domains am I applying at? As I said,
Exactly. Yeah.
I really think it's the core of everything. So there's really no I'm just applying it to everything. Everything I learn, this consists of makes up for the about 90% of my items, because
Oh damn.
I just love them so much. They have been so effective in my life, and I just use them basically for everything. And yeah, just math,
Yeah. I
just
think
general ideas and everything.
if you watch that lecture, it'll be clearer. Just like he goes to the very extreme with it. When he says analogy is the core of cognition, he means that absolutely. And he gives examples. I don't know if it was in that talk or a related one, of like how all words that come to your mind, it's just your brain going, this is a situation that is like other, you know, he had the example of and situations or but situations. I like this and, or I like this but, your brain is going, oh, this situation is like the other and situations.
Yeah.
And so it bubbles up that to your consciousness. It's like everything is an analogy where your brain is going, this is like that, it's not like this, whatever, And so he really means it's the core.
Yeah. I
So
absolutely believe this is so it's been so impressive how well these manifest themselves, these items in real life, and have come up with very many these creative associations just because of these items, and they just pop up in my everyday life, whereas my past items, your typical Q&As where you answer things, they just this feels to me that like they need to be specifically questioned from you, and just I didn't see them. I think I saw only like 5% at max from my collection in my real life, so that's very low
Okay.
applicability. And
Right.
yeah, so I don't know, it's just amazing to me how often I'm seeing and these things are popping on my head, and all right, this is in my collection. This definitely. Oh, right, connection again. Connection item from this and that, and it's just like several times per day, 10 times per day, 20. I don't. Just
Wow.
so actually affects my behavior and thinking, and just this is why I really don't need I don't really need more validation for this even if it's been like only 2 months, but it's just
right.
because it's made huge difference that I'm totally sold on this.
I wonder what the cause of that is, because some people I can imagine some people saying, oh, that's because of some more generalized principle of elaborative encoding or whatever it is, something like this.
Yeah.
So
It's
because you're putting more
possible.
effort into understanding, that's what's causing it. It's not the analogy itself, it's just the effort put forth to understand.
Absolutely possible, but I don't really mind, and I doubt that it's about the effort, because I've been experimenting all kinds of strategies of speed reading and reading very loosely and barely concentrating, just reading quickly. And then we have the other extreme where I try to really focus on everything, and I'm I'm making a point that I'm very aware of my levels of concentration, just because I've been experimenting so much with a SEM of different ways of learning and encoding and concentrating and all this, and even if it were, I don't mind. I'm having the outcomes I want. I'm having the applicability I want, and it really doesn't matter for me that what's causing this. But it seems to me this is the solution. I'm using this. It's great. I'm happy.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's like at some level, if you're trying to accomplish something and you do accomplish it, is it worth it to try to figure out exactly what aspect of what you did is making it happen? It's like, yeah, maybe if you're trying to discover new insights, but at the same time, who cares? It's working. So
yeah,
there's a time and a place to figure it out, and I definitely think. And just for clarity, my view on it is that the connections themselves are largely what's doing the work, but I don't quite understand the circuitry involved with that. And I'm using that term very loosely there, but I don't quite understand why it is that, like an analogy or saying this is like that. I don't really understand why that helps.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Another thing I was interested in exploring is like how the types of analogies you're making in your items have changed over time, because really what drew me into this whole discussion about connection items was talking with Matt, because Matt's been learning programming recently. He's been learning C# pretty intensively, and it was really interesting to hear about like his rate of progress has been very impressive to me. Like when I talk with him, like he seems to use all the lingo in a very professional way. He seems to know what he's talking about. It could just be a facade, but if it is, it's a very impressive one because he seems to genuinely display like a deep level of understanding about aspects of the C# language, which is pretty complex. So one thing I noticed was that at the beginning, when he started out using these connection items to learn C#, he was making I don't know how to frame it. I wrote down here less semantically relevant links between something in his life and C#. By that I mean he was making links between things like cooking and like, I don't know, just commuting, for example, on the bus or whatever, and some aspect of the C# language. So one example I think I wrote down, I can't remember if this was him, Matt, who told me about this, or Alexi, but it was sort of the same style as this. He was saying something about like in cooking, let's say you have a bunch of spring onions and you want to chop them up. Well, there's one way you could go about it. You could chop each individual spring onion up by itself, or you could parallelize the process by holding them in your hand and then chopping through all of them at once. And that's sort of an example of process abstraction in when you create functions in C#, you package together something and then run it over a bunch of data rather than doing one by one. And that's sort of like the same thing. And it's a good way to understand intuitively what process abstraction is and why functions are valuable, right? So to begin with, his analogies were these sorts between an unrelated external system and the target domain, C#, right? But over time, he started to, this is very recently, I sort of noticed him saying things like, I can't come up with a good example, but it was like he was making analogies between things within C#. So he's been learning C# for, let's say, 3 months now. And I guess some parts of the C# language, some aspects of that system have really crystallized in his mind. And now he's able to use those to understand other parts of the system. So he's like making analogies within the target system.
Yeah, absolutely.
So basically what I'm wondering is, have you experienced the same thing? Do you think that's common? Do you think it's better to try and shift towards making analogies within the target system, or do you think you can always make analogies between external systems and the target system? Like, how do you feel about that?
No, I think initially it helps if the domain is very abstract, like I can imagine programming be at first. So he needs to resort to some real life analogies he already knows. So he's kind of building this framework. He's building these, first node, first small cluster of things where he's making analogy between cooking and the programming thing. And now as he builds up these concepts, now he might have couple concepts understood of programming, right? And there start to be parallels and analogies between concepts itself inside of the programming, and now he can start building. The more you have, the more you can attach these things, more you can make links, and it kind of spreads. It spreads exponentially. You have more receiving ends to attach links to, and it's kind of this is why I think like these connection items are so overpowered as compared to typical Q&As, because with Q&As you work only with one node, you work only with one thing, but with connection items you have this network effect, and we probably all understand how great that effect is, that you create one node, now two things connects to it, and now more things connect to these two nodes, and it kind of spreads. It's like disease. It's just, I don't know, to me it's so amazing. Yeah.
It's like a knowledge disease.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like with every node you add, you can add many more nodes.
Yes.
I think it's called combinatorial explosion or something. And I don't know, often in like computer science problems, it's a bad thing because the problem you want to solve is like increasing, like the effort required to solve it increases with every node you add. But in this case, it's really like in our favor to try and increase the number of nodes because we gain more connections and more knowledge. So it's like a really good situation to be in.
Exactly.
It's like the switch between like far-reaching analogies and close analogies sort of correlates, I would imagine, with the amount of chunks you have in a particular field. And I'm using chunks in that, in that psychological sense of, if you've ever like read Barbara Oakley's work, you'll know what I'm talking about, or Herbert Simon, or people like this. But as your amount of chunks in a field increases, you have more points of contact to make analogies within that field. You know what I mean? So I think it's partly that. And I also think partly it doesn't matter. The closeness of the analogies is only a consequence. It almost doesn't matter, because the aid, I think, again, it's about repeating brain states. So an analogy, you're trying to understand something, right? And then your brain goes, oh, it's like this. Or maybe you deliberately are making analogies to help yourself understand, right? So then you understand something with the use of an analogy. And the encoding of that analogy in an item, that's just trying to repeat the brain state where you understood. And so, of course, it's going to work. To me, this is like, I'm very confused by the way people talk about items sometimes. And to me, this is very obvious. You are just trying to repeat the brain state where the analogy aided your understanding of some particular concept. And so if you remember that, then you're going to remember the understanding, right? Does that make sense?
That's a very good way to put it. Yeah, repeating the brain state of like understanding something. That's
there you go, right? And speaking of the word repeat, this phrase, repeated analogies expand concepts. I think that is a really wonderful phrase. And also, this relates to another point about treating this concept of an analogy very loosely. The analogies are very loose. So an analogy could be, it's an instantiation of some particular concept. So you learn something, and then you can make an item about a particular situation in which you would employ this information. And so that's like an analogy, right? Maybe it literally is an analogy, and that expands the concept because you're repeating analogies. And so when people are talking about using information in real life, by having items that instantiate this information, that act as an analogy, and therefore expand the concept, the spreading activation, to say it in technical terms, will increase. So you'll think of it in more situations, and in the proper situations in real life. So an analogy isn't just, how does this relate to that? It can be an instantiation of a particular concept or piece of information or whatever it is.
Yeah, that is very, very good way to put it, Sad. I really think it that way. I'm just building these instances, and as I have more instances of something, some higher order thing, some abstraction, and like I use this like we have a concept animal, like it's a man-made name for something that relates these birds and foxes. So we have birds, we have foxes, we have rabbits. These are the instances, right? And as we start noticing that they are just these freaking creatures running in wild, and we start to make these relations, and they are instances of this higher order thing, then we make this generalization, and the concept animal is born out of this. And yeah, I think instance is the right way to think about it. And the more instances you have, the more expanded the concept is, the more applicable it will be, the more, I don't know, it's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, and I think that opens it up for people, like, there's some kind of puritanism or something with making items where it's like, just encode the facts, and, we talked about this before, I think, about, the balance of how much do you encode with items, and how much do you let your brain develop on the fly. And I sort of fall more onto the side now of encoding more with items, because what it relates to this other concept I've been tinkering with, which is like upfront abstraction. You want to abstract upfront, because what people are looking for is to learn information, and then they have this originating nugget, right? And then they go through life, and that nugget will pop into the mind at the right times and produce a new quantity, abstraction, a new concept, whatever, like on the fly. And that can happen, surely. But I think a way to increase the likelihood of higher level concepts being developed, higher level abstractions, higher level generalizations, is to spot the ones that you initially think of. Like when you first learn something, you may have things pop to mind like, oh, that would be useful in this situation, or that's like this, or this is that, whatever. So encode those, do that abstraction, that little bit of abstraction up front with items, and then let your brain use those pre-existing abstractions to produce newer quantities and think of things at the right time. Again, the spreading activation, the notion of that. So I think it's all interrelated.
Very interesting. Another thing I wanted to ask both of you is, what do you think the relationship is between analogies and mnemonics? Like, are they instances of the same thing? Like, how do they relate to each other? Like, in my mind, I've always been reluctant to use mnemonics because I've always felt that you're sort of making an arbitrary connection between something in your mind that isn't necessarily related in any semantic or meaningful way to something in the target domain, right? And so I've always tried to favor making the semantic links rather than these sort of arbitrary ones. But do you think that mnemonics and analogies, they exist on the same spectrum? So on one hand, you have very asemantic analogies, which would be mnemonics, and then on the other hand, you have really semantic analogies, which would be, I don't know, just good analogies. Are they sort of the same thing, or are they completely different?
I think Nace would probably have some good input there.
Yeah, I see this mnemonics as this artificial framework. This I don't know. I think it depends how I see was using word mnemonic kind of broadly, and it might not mean the same thing what people think. But if we're talking about this, having some mental image and making connection that about some abstract knowledge. I don't know. I just see mnemonics is kind of derived. How derive? Yeah, derived
Yeah, that works.
from the whole idea of connections, brain being concept network. So it's kind of as you said, it's kind of a arbitrary thing where we are basically building categories. So there's kind of overlap when you explained the cooking thing where Matt was relating cooking to programming. So it's kind of mnemonic thing in itself. You have the abstract domain of programming and you have the cooking. So mnemonics is kind of building these arbitrary categories. We're putting things together. We think that we have no relations to some very abstract thing or something we want to remember. Then we bundle up them together. And now when you recall the familiar thing like some image, then that concept category activates, and now you remember the related thing. Yeah, I can't really explain it precisely. I just see it as a derived thing.
Yeah, I agree with that because mnemonics, they rely on either the circuitry of the brain that deals with imagery, which is much the imagery is much more stable in the mind in terms of memories than words, and so that's one aspect of mnemonics, and they often rely on that. And another is they rely on pre-existing memories, so you can essentially force or forge a connection between something you already know and some new piece of information just by being creative and linking them in sort of nonsensical or trivial ways, this kind of thing. And it can act as a mnemonic aid, but it's like, because it relies on pre-existing memories, that's like a huge component of mnemonics. That means that if you have a genuine connection in the mind already, that's much better, because that will get reinforced all the time. Plus, it actually links to something real, which is just inherently more useful. So, and it's like I said the other day, and James has mentioned it. It's a grammatically incorrect quote, I think, but meaning is the brain's natural mnemonic. I really think that's true, and that's why it's much harder to learn like nonsense syllables, this kind of thing, than it is to learn a list of like truly useful stuff that makes sense to you. So.
No, that was great. Both of you, that was awesome. Like, just as you both were saying that, it sort of occurred to me that mnemonics and analogies are very similar in terms of their like low level functioning. You're attaching something to something in your mind that is already very stable, right? To some memory that is very stable. But
Yeah.
the difference is that mnemonics, the connection you're making is not as semantic. So it's almost like the performance in an SRS system between mnemonics and analogy items might be very similar because the memory, sort of the way you're encoding the memory is very similar, right? But their performance in real life will be very different because with analogies, you're actually making a semantic link, and that will help much more with like making associations, creative associations, and things like that because the connection has meaning, it has relevance in the real world.
Right.
Yeah, and it's just because of that, it's way easier to maintain, even without space repetition, because you're seeing this thing manifest itself in real life, and you get repetition that way. And the more expanded the concept is, the more you are gonna see that, and the more repetition you are getting in, even without the SRS. And on the other hand, we have the mnemonic thing, which is way harder to maintain in the sense that as it's arbitrary. Now, when there's way higher chance of something interfering that image you are associating with, and the more you have mnemonics, the more chaotic I believe it's gonna be. And I don't know. To me, it seems like a way more efficient thing to have this kind of semantic, natural analogies.
Exactly. Yeah.
I agree. And again, I think a part of this that we touched on, but it's really useful, is this helps you determine the usefulness or your current level of understanding of things. Like, it's much better to truly understand some small set of things than to have barely any information about some like significantly larger set of things. I really believe that. So I just think this helps focus more on applicability, because if it's not able to be connected, it's not applicable, probably. So I think that's really useful. Plus, we've talked about this before. If you really understand a concept, when you hear the word, something flashes in your mind. You know what I mean? You get this mental imagery very quick of that thing, even if it's not like animal, for example. When someone says animal, I know what that is. But if you said to me, "What's an animal?" it's not like I would be able to describe it right away. But internally, I can work with animal as a concept. I grok the concept of animal, so to say. And I feel like these analogies help internalize concepts in a way that you don't get if you're just working with the words. In some way, it's like the analogies gives you access to the idea underneath. Whatever the underlying idea is, it's like that becomes the thing of import, the thing you're accessing. And then the words are just sort of a wrapper. And again, Douglas Hofstadter in this talk, Analogies of Cognition, talks about, what happens when we chunk things is, related concepts grouped together, and then we put a membrane around it, and then we have that one thing. And somehow all the detail at all the layers of the stack below that higher level concept are sort of abstracted away. So you can think of a really high level concept and you're unburdened by all the details within, because your brain has sort of grouped this all into one thing, even if it contains many, many layers of abstraction or detail. And so I think these analogies, again, repeated analogies expand concepts. And so if that is true, which I believe it is, it makes intuitive sense to me, and I really think that is an accurate statement. It may be kind of loose with the neuroscience. I don't know enough, but I'm operating on the assumption that's true, right? So if that's true, if we make enough of these analogy items, and again, that's very loose, but if we make enough of these, then our concepts will expand. So if we look at every concept like it has sub-concepts, we're grouping more things into it, and we're abstracting away more and more detail, and then we're putting a membrane around those new things, and we have a higher level concept now. And it's just this procedure seems magically useful to me. And again, it feels kind of silly. Maybe people already know this, but in my view, people have never really discussed connection items or analogy items like this. So even though it's kind of an obvious
Yeah,
discovery if you're someone like Hofstadter, or if you work in cognitive science anyway, maybe this is obvious, but to this field, to
yeah, but it's
us, to
like
me, it certainly wasn't.
we don't see people using spatial repetition for this anyway, so I think that's kind of
Right.
new aspect. I think this idea is like a dirty old thing, very old thing. People have done this for ages, reasoning by analogy and this kind of thing. But now we apply spatial repetition and repeated analogies, expand concepts, and what is better way to repeat knowledge than spatial repetition? Nothing.
Exactly right. There we go.
All right.
So
Well,
wonderful.
so for people who aren't who haven't tried this out yet, or maybe they aren't even familiar with like all of this stuff that we've been discussing, like how should they go about practically applying what they've just listened to on this podcast? Like what can people actually do to start making analogy items to sort of test out whether they're worthwhile?
Well,
I'll just. Oh, you want to go first?
no, I was just pointing out that as we mentioned, there's like we all use different way of going about it, but I think the principles are the same. Underlying principles are the same. And
Right.
if you wanna understand and actually create these items, I think everybody should watch the video in the description. Analogy is the core of cognition, and I think that really helps understanding how this works, and this way you'll be better at making these kind of items.
Right. I completely agree with that. That lecture is very, very good. And if I could give two principles, which I think about often and I use as sort of a guiding light, and there's probably more than this, I just haven't articulated them or discovered them within myself, but I've already touched on them. One is be mindful of the fact that just because an idea is yours doesn't mean you won't forget it. And once you do that, you'll start to recognize just how liable you are to forgetting your own opinions even. If you form an opinion about something and you don't think about it for a while, you're going to forget it. And so maybe you could reason yourself once again, given the same material, to the same opinion, right? But how about you skip the line and encode that opinion itself or why you think that, right? So just be mindful of the fact that you will forget your own ideas. So if you have an idea, if you have a connection, if you have whatever, write it down and then go a step further if you want to, encode that in a set of items. And try to be abstract with it, so you're not locking yourself into a way of thinking that can evolve over time, right? So that's one principle, and another one is this principle of this upfront abstraction. Instead of hoping that by learning these words and encoding a set of items about these words, that your brain will then activate them at the appropriate time in real life later on, recognize what's going on in your brain as you're learning it. For me, at least, and I think it's the same for others. When you're learning something, your brain is often going, oh, that's useful here. That's like this. This is that. Whatever. So encode that. It doesn't matter that you're encoding the actual instantiations. That's good. That will expand the concept. And I think, and I don't have any data for this, but this is my intuition. I think that will expand the concept such that the spreading activation for it will expand. And the actual practical meaning of that is that instead of not thinking of your items at the right time, you will think of them at the right time. And you'll make creative associations because your brain will be accessing the deeper meaning of the thing. And so a lot more situations will seem related. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
That definitely makes sense.
I have also one principle to or pitfall to avoid that. There's difference between making an analogy and there's distinction between making an analogy and making connotation. So as I first started with this, I experimented with these items. I noticed like I have a sentence. So now I used to get like I thought I got like thousands of connections, like not thousands, like many connections from that. But these were like connotations of some word. So I was basically operating with words, what this sounds to me like, and it wasn't about the relation of the idea to another, but it was like what this word, what kind of word this is related to or whatever. So what you wanna rather do is extract the message of one sentence. You read the sentence and extract the idea behind that and work with the whole idea of
Right.
the sentence.
Right.
But yeah.
People people try to force this, and I think it's important to just feel it. It's like morality. When you know something is wrong, it's just a feeling, and when you know you're forcing it, you'll just feel that. So just don't force it. Don't make an artificial connection. Just rely on the real ones. And if you can't find any real ones, that means either A, this information is not useful to you, or it's just not useful yet, and you can go find stuff to more deeply understand it. So I think just use your internal mechanism to determine if it's forced.
Yeah, exactly. And if you can't come up with I have these items that I can't come up with connection at the time of creating the item, it's all fine. I just postpone that and come back to it later, and without every time something popped up later on. So just give it a time, get more knowledge, and this connection they start to build up very quickly as you're aware of this whole thing.
That's really good advice. That's like employing incremental writing almost, but for incremental analogy making. So
exactly.
I think that's
yes. There we go.
There we go.
Analogy making. There we go, baby. One other thing I was going to ask you is, would you both be down to share some items on Twitter? Let's get the conversation started. Let's give the people something to maybe draw inspiration from. Would you be down to do that? Oh
yes, let's do it.
Yeah.
Well,
sure.
If you want to join the conversation, you should join us on Twitter. Make sure to follow our Twitters. They'll be in the description. Thanks very much for listening. This has been a beautiful podcast. I'm so glad we brought Nice on to do this one because
yes, indeed, this is wonderful.
He is truly one of the masters of connection writing and of analogy making.
Thanks, guys.
Nice. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
All right. See you guys.